I think the U.S. administration would want to stay away from sanctioning Vladimir Putin himself. That, in some ways, would be an economic nuclear weapon that, frankly, would have probably more impact on the diplomacy and the geopolitics than it would on Russia's financial standing. I think Russia's financial isolation can be handled in a much more nuanced and, frankly, aggressive way by going after some of the oligarchs, by isolating some of the Russian banks, and by focusing on some of the illicit activity that the Russians are engaged in, whether it's ties to organized crime or supplying Assad and Damascus with weapons and chemicals. So there's a whole range and suite of things that the U.S. can do. It doesn't require you to go after Vladimir Putin as a person. You can go after his interests and those who are close to him and achieve the same impact. The one thing I would say, though, that you could do that would, I think, get Vladimir Putin's attention and would certainly perhaps alter the decision calculus of those around him is to announce an asset hunt or asset recovery effort to look at kleptocracy, not just for Viktor Yanukovych and the regime that just fell in Kiev, which the Europeans have done already, but also to say we're going to do this for the Russian government itself. We know that there is a mass degree of kleptocracy that comes out of Moscow. We know that there is control at the top tied to the oligarchs. And so this effort to target the oligarchs is really an effort to go after the money that's been hidden by Russian leadership outside of Moscow. And that is going to be an all-out global effort. It will take months, if not years. But that's the kind of thing that would get Vladimir Putin's attention, because to the extent that there are assets that lie outside of Russia that he and his allies control, those are potentially assets that would become subject to that kind of an effort. I think what you'll see are gradual I think what you'll see is a gradual escalation, a number of steps to not only implement the existing sanctions, things like adding Russian names, adding perhaps Russian businesses and companies who can no longer do business in the United States, who will have their assets frozen, but also perhaps an expanding target set of Russian banks and financial institutions that are tied to other activities outside of the Ukraine. Because currently what these sanctions do is sanction those individuals and entities tied to the instability in the Ukraine. If the U.S. wants to open the spigot on a financial pressure campaign that matters to Russia, it will begin to target those Russians who are tied to things like organized crime, tied to Syria, tied to sanctions evasion, tied to doing business with Iran, North Korea, Belarus. The whole suite of sanctions and financial measures that the U.S. has to bring to bear could be brought to bear against Russia. If you take the financial gloves off, you could begin to hurt the Russians in a fairly dramatic way. But that takes political will, it takes some time, and it will be a process of escalation that you'll see over time from the U.S.